Hi, everybody. Well, the next time you see me, I will be in a different place and I will be older. Right now, it's Sunday, April 28th. On Wednesday, I and my wife will be moving into a new home. That's why most of my stuff here is gone. It's it's actually on the floor right here. And Friday, it's my birthday. So for my birthday, I decided to get into a huge amount of debt. This will be the last video you see for a few days. I'm not really sure. I'm going to try to get to work really quickly because this is kind of like my favorite thing to do. Inspired by one of the recent debates I posted, I started looking at the gospel narratives, specifically around the resurrection, and I said, okay, how badly do they contradict? It's pretty bad. What I thought would be fun was I'm going to go through the gospel narratives, and first I'm just going to go through what each book says, just like in a pretty linear fashion. And then I'm going to show what the really bad contradictions are, maybe talk a little bit about some of the things where it's like, this isn't exactly a contradiction, I guess. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the best possible version of the story that doesn't contradict. Now, it's not possible if you take into consideration everything that's in the four Gospels. It's literally impossible. There's basically these two things that make the whole thing irreconcilable. But I thought this would be kind of fun, so let's get to it. Now, in the Bible, Matthew is the first gospel, but scholars agree that Mark was the first gospel to be written, and there are many stories where the other gospels have differences in them compared to Mark, and those differences are what have led scholars to say pretty clearly that, yes, Mark was the original version, and people made changes to them because they didn't like Mark's version of the story, etc. So in Mark, Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, I believe it is, and some woman whose name is spelt vaguely like salami, go to anoint the dead body of Jesus with perfumes. This was apparently a traditional custom, so they're on their way to the tomb to do this. And as they are walking to the tomb, they wonder to themselves, how will we move the stone? Because the stone is so big and mighty. But then when they get there, lo and behold, the stone is already rolled away. They go into the tomb, and in the tomb is a young man in a white robe. He tells the women, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you in Galilee. There you will see him as he told you." And what the women do is they run away and they tell nobody. Now, scholars pretty much agree that that is where the original Gospel of Mark ended, but there are some other verses that were added later on because the ending is just not good. It's basically a cliffhanger, and it has serious issues with the other Gospels. Now, what happens later is Jesus appears to two of the disciples, although they are not named. Those disciples go to tell the rest, but they do not believe them. Then later, Jesus appears to, quote, the 11 themselves. He says, "Shame on you for not believing your friends," and tells them to go out and baptize people, forgive sins, and play with snakes and drink poison because you'll be fine. Chronologically, we have Matthew next, although this is the first gospel in the actual Bible. Now in Matthew, it only says that the two Marys were walking toward the tomb. Nothing is mentioned about who will roll the stone away or anything like that. Now, when they get there, the stone is still in front of the tomb. However, then a violent earthquake occurs. Then an angel comes down from heaven and moves the stone out of the way. The angel frightened the two guards that were guarding the tomb, and they fell over. The angel says to the women, "Don't be afraid, for I know you are looking for Jesus who is crucified. He's not here, he is risen as he said. Come see where he lay. Then go quickly to tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him." Now, as the women are on the way to tell the disciples, Jesus actually appears to them and they bow at his feet and he says, no, go and tell my disciples. Now, this isn't actually in Matthew, but presumably the women do go and tell the disciples. What Matthew does mention, and this is not in any other gospel, is that the guards went to tell the priests everything that happened. The priests bribe the soldiers and tell the soldiers to tell everybody his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. It says, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Funny how Josephus never mentioned this. I could not find a single source that corroborates that Jews believed this. At an unspecified time later, Jesus appears to his disciples in Galilee. Some of them doubted, but Jesus just basically says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now go and make disciples of nations, baptize them, and teach them to obey everything I commanded. Next up is Luke. Now all Luke says is the women went to the tomb. In Luke, the stone is already rolled away. So the women go into the tomb and they see that it's empty. Then suddenly, 2 men appear. They say, why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, he is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again. Now it says when the women got back from the tomb, they told these things to the 11 disciples. Remember, Judas committed sewer slide, so he's dead. Now at this point, women are mentioned by name. We have Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, but now we have some woman named Joanna, and then it says the others. Now when the women told the disciples this, they did not believe it. It sounded like nonsense to them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. He bent over, saw the strips of linen laying by themselves, and he went away wondering what had happened. Now Luke's narrative is much longer than any of the others, so we have some added stuff. A man named Cleopas and another man who is not named are walking along when all of a sudden Jesus appears to them. However, the 2 men do not recognize it's Jesus until he disappears, and then they say, holy crap, that must have been Jesus. Now those 2 men go and find the disciples in Jerusalem. They say to them, it's true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. I don't know if that's supposed to mean the other guy with Cleopas was Simon or whatever. Then it says, while they were all talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. This startled them, but Jesus says, no, look, it's me. See my hands and my feet. They still kind of don't believe him, but they're in shock. They give Jesus a piece of fish. What a reanimated Son of God, actual God in the reincarnated, well, not reincarnated, but resurrected flesh is going to do with a piece of broiled fish. I have no idea, but he eats it. Finally, we have the Gospel of John, and this is really bad. The Gospel of John specifically only mentions Mary Magdalene, and it specifically says that she was heading toward the tomb before the sun had even risen. When she gets there, she sees that the stone is already rolled away, so she goes to tell Simon, Peter, and John. They all run to the tomb, but John gets there first, and then Simon Peter appears next. John doesn't want to go in, but Simon Peter goes into the tomb, and then John says, all right, bet. It says they look around in the tomb, and then once they see the linens just sitting there, they believed. But what they believed isn't actually made very clear. So they leave. Then Mary Magdalene is sitting outside the tomb, and she starts crying. Then 2 angels appear, and they're all like, bro, why are you crying? She says to them, they've taken my Lord away, but I don't know where he is. Then Mary Magdalene turns around, and Jesus is there, and he says, why are you crying? Then all of a sudden, Mary Magdalene's like, oh, wait, you're Jesus. Cool. Then Mary Magdalene goes to see the disciples and tells them everything that happened. Many days later, Jesus appears to the disciples, except Thomas, who was not there. Now, Thomas did not believe it when the other disciples told him about what happened, but then Jesus appears to Thomas and he says, here, put your finger in my hands where they crucified me. Put your hand into my side where they stabbed me with the spear. And then Thomas is all like, wow, you really are Jesus. Okay, so chronologically, these are the things that happen. The reason there are spaces sometimes is because from what I've been able to tell, like this event in Matthew is like the last event that occurs. If we assume all these things happened, that had to have happened last. And with Mark here, the other disciples visiting the tomb, that has to happen in sort of a gap before Jesus appears to them. So that's why it's way down here. Everything that I have boldened and put in red, these are strong contradictions. This green one, I'll talk about that later. So the way I did this mostly starts with the base of, let's say that Mark is true. Well, if Mark is true, then this cannot possibly be true. They can't run away and say nothing and go and tell the disciples. Now, what a lot of apologists will say is it can't be a contradiction unless it explicitly states, for example, for Mark, that the women ran away and never said anything to anybody until they died, and even their spirits never communicated after death, and so on and so on. So that's an extremely stupid rhetorical trick, and if you appeal to that, then it is always impossible that there ever can be a contradiction. So that is completely dishonest. The honest way to read this is, the reason Mark doesn't say, oh, and until the end of days they never said anything ever again, was because you don't need to say that in that case. If this is the truth, we don't need to qualify that with a bunch of absurd extra things. Another huge problem with Matthew is the angel rolling away the stone. We'll see at the end that there could have been an angel there, but the angel can't roll away the stone because when the women get there, the stone is rolled away in every instance. Now, what they try to do is tell you that the women go and visit the tomb twice. That's why I have this one in green here. They'll tell you that because in John, it just talks about Mary and it's very early in the morning. She goes and visits the tomb twice. Now, I still don't see how that could possibly work because she has to go there the first time and the stone is rolled away, or she gets there and it's not rolled away, but the angel rolls it away while she's there. But for some reason, John didn't write any of that down. He just writes down that the stone, he just skips all the angel parts and says, yeah, and the stone was rolled away. Absolutely ludicrous way to try to make Matthew work with any of the others, but that's what they do. Now, I didn't include really any of the dialogue of what happens in the tomb because those things could all theoretically be said. It's extremely bizarre to imagine that the entire narrative of the angel doing anything, but also what the angel says, is not recorded in any other gospel. That's very weird, but it's not like literally impossible, I suppose. However, in Mark, the women go into the tomb. There's a young man in a white robe. But in Luke, it says that the tomb is empty, and then suddenly 2 men appear. I think that's a huge problem. Similarly, in John, the tomb is empty when Peter and John go in there, but then it's 2 angels that appear, and Jesus appears. Now, we're gonna find a way to make that work, but these are pretty bad discrepancies. Peter visiting the tomb in Luke, and Peter and John visiting the tomb in John, these 2 things absolutely do not work together. They can't work because in John, Mary Magdalene goes to tell Peter and John, and only those 2, and both of them go and visit the tomb, and then Mary goes and talks to the disciples. In John, Mary talks to all of the disciples, then Peter visits the tomb. The final really bad one is where in Luke, Jesus appears to all of the disciples. It very specifically says that Jesus appears to the 11 while they are in Jerusalem. And it's also very clear in Luke that this is the first time that Jesus appears to them. Now in John, Jesus appears to all the disciples except for Thomas, and then Jesus appears to all of the disciples plus Thomas. Those 2 things cannot work. The story of Cleopas and the other man, that can be what happens in Mark with those added verses. Mark is just so unspecified that there isn't really a problem with that. The biggest issue with all of this is John. John absolutely makes these gospels impossible to work together. But the other huge problem is what is said in Mark, that the women run away and say nothing, and what is said in Matthew about the angel rolling away the stone because the stone is not yet rolled away. This is my best attempt to tell a resurrection narrative with the fewest number of contradictions that includes all 4 gospels. As you can see, we have a lot of problems. So the first thing is Mary Magdalene and some other number of women, we can't really say how many, go to the tomb before sunrise, and they see that the stone is already rolled away from the tomb. Mark, John, and Luke, they can all work okay in this instance, but the story about what the angel does in Matthew, at least in terms of rolling the stone away, there just is not a way to make that work. Then Mary goes to tell Simon and John, who go to look inside the tomb. Then Simon and John leave. Now at this point, Mary Magdalene enters the tomb, and there is a white man in a robe, and there are two angels. The man says Jesus is not here, he's risen. Now go tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee, and the angels ask why she is crying. Then the angel from Matthew basically tells Mary Magdalene all the same stuff. That could have technically happened like between 3 and 4, but we can put it anywhere and it works okay. Now, after Mary's already been spoken to twice, the angel tells her basically the same thing, that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. Then at this point, two men suddenly appear and say Jesus is risen, but they don't say anything about Galilee. That's kind of nice because you don't have two completely different sets of characters saying the same thing, because that would be kind of a weak contradiction. It'd basically be the same as Becky said X, and then the other person says, no, Jessica said X. And at that point, Mary Magdalene turns around and Jesus is standing there. He tells her he is ascending into heaven. Now, the women in Mark could not have left and said nothing. That absolutely cannot work. And the most charitable thing I can imagine to say is, well, the women didn't say anything, but Mary Magdalene told the disciples. But it says in Mark, they ran away and said nothing. It's not being specific because it doesn't need to be specific. Now, in some Gospels, it says the women went and told them. In others, it just says Mary Magdalene. So we can just say the women go and tell 10 of the disciples what all the people in the tomb told them. But on the way, they run into Jesus and he says that he'll be in Galilee. Now, we have several problems. Peter could not have visited the tomb again like it says in Luke, because it's the exact same story as John. You just have to imagine that Peter has Alzheimer's or something. It just simply can't work. And Luke's version of Mary's visit cannot be accurate because, according to John, Thomas was not there. In Luke, it says that she told the 11. Here's what it specifically says in Luke. They found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, it's true, the Lord has risen, so on and so forth. And then it says, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. Luke is saying all 11 are present when Jesus appears. John does not. Now, this is getting kind of confusing, but so far, Jesus has not yet appeared. I was just discounting Luke's version of that narrative. So the next thing that happens is Cleopas and that other man, they have a run-in with Jesus, and they go and tell the disciples, and then Jesus appears as Cleopas and the other man are talking to them. Now, the problem here is Jesus can indeed appear to the disciples and Cleopas and the other man. This all works fine, and this is between Mark and Luke tells this story. But the detail in Luke, where it says Jesus appears to all 11 disciples, that cannot be true if John is true. Now, you also cannot make the argument that Jesus appeared to the disciples more than once, because in Luke, although he threw this out earlier, now again, you have to argue with somebody that's saying that there are no contradictions and that they're all true. According to my narrative, this would almost kind of sort of work in a weird way. It is kind of giving me a headache. But you cannot assume univocality and make this work, because in Luke it very clearly says that Peter went and saw that the tomb was empty and the disciples have not yet heard from Jesus. Specifically in Luke it says, some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman said, but they did not see Jesus. So Jesus has now appeared, but not to Thomas. A week after Mary told the disciples what happened, Jesus appears to all 11 of them for the second time, and then Thomas believes. Matthew's version of Jesus appearing cannot be true because Jesus appears to the disciples in Galilee, not Jerusalem, and not all of them believe. So in Matthew, that is the first encounter they have with Jesus post-resurrection. There are some arguments about how many times did Jesus appear. And again, I'm actually arguing that Jesus did appear twice, because in John, it very clearly states that Jesus appears twice. But that first incidence of Jesus running into them, the Mark narrative cannot be correct. Now, you could say this in very slightly different ways without any contradictions. The main point was just to point out what the contradictions are. Now, here's an interesting way of doing it. Let's just say the Gospel of John doesn't exist. There are many other problems with John, and it's very clearly the most different of all the Gospels, probably because it was written for political reasons. But if we just assume that if we just completely throw out John, we get a much simpler narrative with fewer problems. So Mary Magdalene and others go to the tomb and they see the stone is rolled away and the tomb is empty. The angel in Matthew, once again, that whole thing with the angel rolling the stone away at least can't happen. The women enter the tomb. There's a man in a white robe and two angels. The man says, Jesus is not here, he is risen. Now go and tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. And an angel asks why Mary Magdalene is crying. Then an angel appears and basically says the same thing. Then two men suddenly appear and say Jesus is risen, but say nothing of Galilee. So again, the women could not have ran away and said nothing, like what it says in Mark. Now, we're missing a whole bunch of stuff here because, again, it's that John narrative where there's also two angels. They talk to Mary, and then Jesus appears to Mary, and she recognizes him. So that's all gone. So the angel and the man in the robe and the two men who suddenly appeared have talked to the women. So they go and tell the disciples what the people in the tomb told them, but they run into Jesus along the way. That works okay. Now, upon hearing this news, Peter doubts the story and goes to look for himself. Not Peter and John, but just Peter. Then the whole story of Cleopas and the other man running into Jesus, going and tell the disciples, and then Jesus appears to all 11 disciples. That happens. We have that same problem with Matthew, the version of when Jesus appears to them, that still cannot work for all the reasons I listed earlier. Of all the problems, this is by far the biggest problem. This cannot be reconciled in any way. I would argue the angel rolling the stone away is the second biggest problem, and then Matthew's version, the discrepancy of when Jesus first appeared, that is the least severe third problem, but these are the problems that you just simply cannot work with, even if we just throw out the Gospel of John, which is not allowed. If we keep John, we just have so many more problems. Like I said, the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, those, or the resurrection piece in those, is pretty short. They would almost work, except for the angel and the women saying nothing. Luke and John are much longer, and they just do not work together at all. But anyways, my camera died, so I can't wave goodbye to you guys, but that is it. Like I said, it'll be a few days until I talk to you. I uploaded 300 videos last year, so I have a ton of bingeable content. You shouldn't have to miss me all that bad. Check out links for like Discord and Patreon and my merchandise store and all that stuff. Thank you guys very much, and I'll see you soon.